Hello world, my name is Udhira from Kodarasa. Today we're going to look at bounded context in domain-driven design. What is bounded context? First of all, boundary and then context. So what context are we even referring to? These are some of the questions that may come up when you hear this word to start with. It's the circumstances that form the setting for an event, a setting, a statement, an idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood. So everyone is clear on what you're talking about when in this specific semantic boundary. Examples using the school management system. Let's use something like a class. A class can mean different things depending on who's talking about it. It can mean the evening or morning class, that is a time of day. It can also mean the physical building, that is class 2J, 3J, 5P, whatever. Again, everyone understands what you mean when you say that. It can also mean the class level that the student is in. I am currently in class 1, next year I'll be in class 2, and so forth. And it can also mean the actual session, to mean I'm in session right now, I'm in class, I'm currently in class. So all these are 4 different ways you can define class to mean all different things. But in this case, everyone involved understands what you're referring to because of the specific context you're talking about. Basically, it is a semantic contextual boundary. Within this boundary, each component of the software model has a specific meaning and does a particular thing. Remember, a bounded context is housing the ubiquitous language, and now the ubiquitous language is what explains, it talks about the model that we are trying to model for in the first place. Check out the video on domain modeling so that you can learn more about the process of domain modeling. But ideally, that's where we're at. When doing this, it's important to define the context within which the model applies explicitly. Think about your organization and how you can split. Let's say you have a monolith, and what are some very, very succinct, separate parts of the system, and how do they, like, where are the boundaries? Where does my role start and end, and where does the other one start and end? So understanding those boundaries, that's now what we are referring to when you're talking about the bounding context. When setting boundaries, set them in terms of, these are some things you should consider when trying to set boundaries. Team organizations, this can be a good guide when you already have a team setup in mind. That natural form already set up can help you guide to split up your big model into the bounded context you need to have in your system. Again, we'll see why not to do this depending, again, if the natural setting already does lean into a good split for your big application, then totally use team organizations. Especially, for instance, if you have a monolith but different teams are in charge of the specific parts of the system, then that's a really good guide, is what I'm trying to say. Another thing you can consider is its usage within parts of the application. So if it's being used more in this part, then you can consider that as a place to divide it into a different bounded context on its own. You can also do this using code. So the code already there, even if it's a monolith, it's sometimes very clear that this part only handles a specific part, this part of the code only handles a specific part. So that's a good guideline when you're trying to set boundaries for your bounded context. And last but not least, there's a database schemas. They'll tend to also have specific expertise in a sense. That's another thing that can guide you when trying to figure out what your bounded contexts are and where to apply them. Basically, just a guide on how to set the boundaries. Ensure the model is strictly consistent within these boundaries. Ideally, you shouldn't have content that shouldn't belong to me, and you shouldn't now also be trying to leak your things into other bounded contexts that don't need to know information about you in the first place. Keep anything else outside. Be very clear on the boundaries. Keep anything else outside. Functions of a bounded context. Let's look at some of these functions. For one, it establishes the extent to which a particular model applies. I think that's very clear at this point. Ensures team members have a clear and shared understanding of what needs to stay consistent and how it relates to other contexts. So when the boundaries are very clear, then everyone knows their role, everyone knows specifically what they should be working on and not be working on in the first place. There's a lot of harmony even across teams because of this. It keeps the model pure. You won't be having contents that shouldn't be part of this model when they shouldn't be. So it does keep the model pure. It helps avoid confusion when you need to work with other contexts. You will know where your boundaries lie. Because of this, you won't have any confusion. It's very clear who needs to work on what. You also need to note that other contexts will have their own models applied with differences in terminology, concept rules, and at large, it will be a different ubiquitous language. Have your own, but also know that other people also have the same. It's not a warning or anything. It's just know that it's the same concept through and through if you're following the same model across the teams in your organization. Let's check what goes into the bounded context. For one, the domain model goes into the bounded context. This is very obvious because that's a primary responsibility of a bounded context anyway, so make sure you put that in. A database schema can also go there. When the model drives the creation of a persistent database, then that also goes into this bounded context. The other thing that can go there is user interface views, everything that will now render, help in the creation of your model, in the storage of data for your model. So render the model and drive execution of its behavior, all that can live in the bounded context. Let's look at an example. Back to the school management system, if we were to consider student as a bounded context on its own, what are some of the things that we put in this student bounded context? For one, we would need the student details. It makes sense to have the student details in the student bounded context. Student subjects, not details on these subjects. These are the subjects this student is taking. I don't now need to drill down to now more details about this subject, but just anything pertaining, maybe the score of this subject, the performance, what they need to improve on, specific to the student. But the moment it goes outside the student interest, then it should not be part of the student bounded context. The same applies to student teachers. I can have the student teachers, but then not details around these teachers. That's not something we should be so much concerned about. Student class sessions, student attendance, student extracurricular activities. So all these things, but remember, everything you list needs to be specifically affiliated with the student and only details that help tell the story of the student better, help understand the student better, and nothing more. It encapsulates the ubiquitous language and its domain model. I've repeated that many times, but good to know. It includes what exists to provide interaction with the domain model and support the domain model. So how big should it be? How big should it be? I don't know what I'm trying to do. An attempt at Vogue. Very bad. Anyway, how big should it be? Make a bounded context as big as it needs to completely express the ubiquitous language. So the ubiquitous language in this case is what's guiding how big it is. We'll see ways in which, like when you're trying to size your bounded context, what are some things you shouldn't factor in. But anyway, factor out extra details that are not really part of the core domain. Anything, for instance, when we're talking about the student bounded context, details that are around the teacher, not of concern. That's not something we should be concerned about. So concepts that are not part of your ubiquitous language should not go into. This guides you when trying to size your bounded context, of course, and if you find extra details, get rid of them as soon as possible. You should be careful not to factor out concepts that really belong to the core domain. Again, keep checking and rechecking until you feel you have a really good, clear system that covers everything that you need. So how do you know you sized your bounded context right? You would end up having the wrong size if you allow architecture to influence us rather than the ubiquitous language. The bounded context is also in the ubiquitous language, so that's the only thing that should be guiding the size. You shouldn't be using things like, oh, we use this type of architecture on the last project, so let's use this to guide how big our bounded context is going to be. That's a wrong approach. Remember, just use the ubiquitous language. Check out the video on ubiquitous language to learn more about that if it's not something you're yet familiar with. Another way you can now also have a wrong size of bounded context is when you use team divisions to divide your bounded context. Remember, I also said team divisions can be a way to guide you when trying to create your bounded context, but when sizing then, or it can also be misleading because different companies use different ways to divide up teams. Don't use that completely to guide the size of your bounded context. So don't use the team divisions fully to guide you. It can be a hint, but be aware that it can also corrupt you when trying to create a bounded context. And last but not least, I know we've said don't use architecture, don't use team divisions, but to note, you could think of bounded context in terms of the technical components it lives in, as long as you ensure they don't define it. So just use them as guides, use them as pointers, but that's all they should be. I hope you've learned a lot about bounded context thus far. This is a challenge to you, especially if you've not done domain-driven design before. Think about your organization. What are some of the bounded contexts you can think of? How can you split it up if it were something you had to do as, like, if it was your job to do this? So think about this, and it can be your first step into domain-driven design, your first play at it. And yeah, good luck with that. As always, I am Waithera. Thank you for watching. Until next time, bye.